Today we will talk about the need assessment, training need assessment. Now, whenever we talk about the training and development, then it should be very much relevant, but relevant to what? Relevant to the organization, organizational goals and the individual goals. If any particular training which is not contributing significantly to the organizational goals or individual goals, many times there might be the conflict between the organizational goals and individual goals, and that time the trainer, that he has to balance between the whatever the purpose the organization is interested and whatever the purpose the individual is interested. So, many times it happens that is an individual is given a training which after returning to the workplace he does not find it very much useful, or he is not able to implement because organization has provided the training, but not in the very short time or near time to 1 month or 6 months. Organization is not interested to execute that particular task. If this type of the situation is there, then the training will be wasted and there will be no purpose of the training. So, it is very much important, that is the organizational goals and individual goals are to be linked, connected, and then the training program is to be designed. So, question arises, how to identify the need of organization and the individual. So, best solution to a performance problem whenever we talk about, that is if employees do not know how to perform, there are the expectations of the organization for a particular job, from a particular job. I would like to mention my example, that is when I have joined here in 2003 as an assistant professor, and that time the Professor Premraj sir was the director, and on the first day of the meeting, when Professor Nangia took me, my HOD took me to director Professor Premraj, and Premraj sir on the first day meeting mentioned that is Dr. Rangnekar is aware about the what is our performance appraisal form, which is likely to be filled after the 1 year. But on the day 1 itself, it was told to me that is go this particular performance appraisal form and see that is what is the expectation of the institute from you. This is a very good practice, that is in the beginning itself, if the HR management is ready with the manual, that is what should be the job, what should be the expectation, what is the expectation of the organization from you, and what are the parameters are there. I understand there will be the problems in the objective and subjective. There will be the certain parameters which will be quantified. For example, a training program is to be conducted, training program in a year is to be conducted of the X amount. So, in that case that will be fixed, but there will be that is the your qualitative teaching, then it will be very subjective, it will depend on so many parameters. It depends on the students and teacher, and if it is a MDP training program, then the participants and the trainer and all. But what is expected to perform, if it is more and more it is clear, more and more it is met the objectively, then definitely in that case, that is the training need can be easily identified. Second important point is, if employees have not received the feedback, that becomes very important. This feedback has to be given to the employee time to time. This it will give us an to exposure to him, awareness to him, understanding to him, that is what is expected from him and what he has to, how he has performed. If he has performed well as per the expectations, there are certain benchmarking practices are there, it has been told to him, and then he has to achieve those particular benchmarking practices. If this type of the concepts are clear, then about their performance, then in that case we can easily identify the training needs. If they lack the equipment needed to perform the job, simple example is given, that is, suppose a job is to be done with the help of a particular software only. Then in that case, if they are lacking in that particular software or particular equipment or technology, then that is to be noted. If the consequences for good performance are negative, because if the resources are not managed, many times the employees complain, that is, we have asked for this particular equipment, that equipment is not provided, but from us the expectation is to do this particular job, then in that case definitely there will be the problem, and employees will not be able to meet the targets, the results, expectations, and therefore what is to be done. So therefore if the consequences of the good performance are negative, or if they are unaware of an expected standard, in many organizations it is not been even told that is what is expected from you, then training is not likely to be the best solution in that case. So to identify, what does it mean? It means that to identify the training needs, there should be clear cut guidelines of the performance, that is, what are the performance measurements are to be used at the time of the in quarterly, or maybe the half yearly, or maybe the yearly, and then wherever the employee is lacking, these are the standards, this is the actual performance, and there is, if there is a gap, then that gap is the place for the training programs. So that will be the identifying training needs. Now every organization should have a very systematic process to determine whether training is necessary. As I mentioned, that is, it is not the compulsion, it is not, it should not be a burden, that is, no, you have to go for the training, you have to do training, have you done the training, you have not done any training, then what is your future? Nothing like that. Rather than it should be like this, that is, there is a proper process for an individual, that is, if he continues in the organization, after 2 years what will be the next level job, after 3 years what will be the next level job, after 5 years what will be next level job. At least 10 years planning for an individual is to be done. However, nowadays because of the employee retention is a challenge, nobody is going for the 10 years planning is there, but it is not the question of an individual, it is a question of organization. It is the vision of the organization that will guide that whoever is working on this particular post, that he has to meet this particular benchmark, and then for this purpose he requires this much resources, and to meet these resources, wherever he is lacking, a support is be given in the form of the training. Need assessment is the first step in the instructional design process. We cannot design a training program unless and until we do not know the need, we do not know the topic, that is, the what training program is to be conducted. You can take the help of the consultant, that is, organization is in this particular stage, organization is functioning like this, these are the output, these are the expectations, do you think that there can be any training program and we can meet those expectations? Even if organization is meeting the expectations for today, but the vision, goal, objectives of the organizations, they should link for the future. So training is a continuous process. Any organization which is not in the part of the training, if not conducting the training programs, that no, we are doing good, so there is no, so they are sleeping on their assets, because they have to develop, they have to create the resources for tomorrow, especially manpower resources, in the context of the training what we are talking about. Second is, if the needs are not properly known, then the conduct of training program, that will be very difficult. because training might be conducted, but because it was not known, that is what is the need of a particular trainee, what is the need of a particular participant in the training program, then there will be no match. And then in that case, if first and foremost is, that is we should understand the need, that is what he needs, and are we, whatever input we are providing, is it his need or not. So, one example has been given, one or more of the following situations could occur. Training may be incorrectly used as a solution to a performance problem. It is a very good example is given. I would like to share my experience when I was a labor officer in the Hukumchand mill, and that time there was absenteeism rate was the 14%, which was very high. So, our one of the officers proposed, that is the we should introduce the attendance incentive scheme. We should encourage them to be present on the job. Now, but when we talked to the senior executive said, that is, no, he is supposed to come for the 26 days. If he is not coming for the 26 days, that is a misconduct. Either he should take leave, or he should not be absent without he should not be absent. Then in that case, if we advise any solution to a particular problem, we should be very careful. Another example I would like to give, that the VRS scheme. One of the banks had that time when the VRS was voluntary retirement scheme was very popular, and that time that was introduced by one of the banks. That time private banks were also coming into the market. So, what happened? The talented employees of the organization of the bank, they got the job into the private banks, and they resigned from this particular bank. Those who were the better performers, they left the bank. As a result, what happened? That is, a talent was drained. So, solution to the problem, that has to be very, very carefully we have to suggest and see the consequences. If our solution should not create a problem into a problem. So, that is the performance problem is there, then we have to see that is how we can support. When the solution should deal with the employee's motivation. Now, we have to also see, in further slides I will discuss that, that is it is very necessary, that is what type of the training program we are providing, that should motivate the employees, it should not demotivate the employees. Sometimes this also happens, you are providing the training, you are incurring the cost on him, and then he is not happy, he is not motivated, because he does not find its relevance. Then job design, that job design is to be there, that is this is very, very important. My further sessions will be there on job analysis, job evaluation, job description, job specifications, because whenever we talk about a training, then we have to keep in mind the job design, that is what type of job design, whether it is an unskilled job, it is a semi-skilled job, or it is a skilled job, it is lower management, it is a middle management, it is a top management, what type of the job he is supposed to do, and then if he has to perform this particular job, then what is his performance, if his performance is not as per expectation, what is the reason, and if this is the reason, can we provide him the training, and then there can be the conduct of the training is there. So, therefore, that job design or a better communication of performance expectations is to be there. Now, the training needs program that have to be very careful in the content, what will be the content, what type of the input will be given to them. Then objectives, what are the different objectives are there, as I mentioned, objectives of the organization, objective of the individual, that both are to be seen. Third point is very, very important, that is the method. What type of method you are using? I will be demonstrating each method, for example, decision making, then the case study analysis, then business game, then the exercises, that will be practically we will be demonstrating here, and on basis of that you will find that is the you can use those methods and those pedagogy technique and tools of the training for the at the time of conducting the training at your place. So, therefore, but the appropriate method has to be used at the appropriate time and the appropriate cause and appropriate reason. So, then in that case the because wherever the business game is to be used and where is to be the case studies are to be used, that has to be seen and that care has to be taken. Trainees may be sent to training programs for which they do not have the basic skills, because it is not a development program, it is a training program. So, therefore, the basic learning is to be there and then it is there. Many times it has the professional courses are also as a part of the training programs which has been suggested. And to get a particular training, there is a prerequisite skills are very important. If the person is not having the prerequisite skills, then it becomes very difficult, that is he will be able to adopt that particular training. To adopt that particular training, it is important that is he is having that particular prerequisite skills. Another important is that is the confidence needed to learn. That is, yes, I want to learn this thing. We see nothing is impossible in this world, we keep on saying this thing, but why then the things are not converting? Things are not converting because lack of motivation many times. If there is no motivation, there is no confidence, and then in that case the person will not learn. And there can be the many reasons for the no confidence. There can be the environment, there can be the situation, there can be the heredity even, there can be the type of personality, the person is with the internal locus of control or the external locus of control. Internal locus of control means those who believe in themselves, external locus of control those who believes in outside, and therefore in that case that they say about it is because of the boss, it is because of the colleagues, and like this the external locus of control are there. So, therefore, in that case it becomes very important, that is they should have the confidence, they should raise their internal locus of control and see that is whatever the training program they are going to attend, that will be useful for them, that will make their career, that will help in the workplace, that will improve their performance. So, all these concepts are needed there at the time of the learning the training, participating in the training. Training will not deliver the expected learning, behavior change or financial results that the company expects. If the proper training need is not there, then whatever the change is expected from this particular training program, especially the learning. Again, when we talk about the principles of learning, I have discussed last time the principles of learning, and then when we talk about the principles of learning, it becomes very important, that is the person is supposed to learn on the basis of the need based. It is that he will be very fast in learning once he develop that concept, develop that belief, develop that value, that is yes, I have to learn this particular concept. So, that is expected learning will be there. Then there will be the behavioral change. If properly need has been assessed, then definitely person will adopt and there will be behavioral change. But the person is just because the getting the course certificate, getting the completion of the training, because he has been sent to the attend this particular training, but he is not willing himself, there will be no behavioral change. For behavioral change, you can give the opportunity. You can bring the horse to the water, but cannot force to drink it. So, therefore, in that case it is very important, that is for the behavioral change, then there should be the need to change. If the participant is interested to know the leadership training, because he has to perform leadership at workplace. If a participant is interested to know about the conflict management, because he is facing the conflicts at the workplace, then it will be very relevant. Or sometimes that is the output from training, that is the financial results, right. So, financial results gain will be there only when the needs are properly assessed, those needs are fulfilled during the training program, the employees start performing, and as a result financial results organization will get. Money will be spent on training program, that is obvious, that are unnecessary because they are unrelated, but that money will not be the useful, and if it is the unnecessary because they are unrelated the company's business strategy. As right from the beginning I am saying, that is the organizational goals, organizational strategies, policies, procedures, and individual employees policy procedures that is to be matched. Otherwise whatever money is spent on that, then that will not be fruitful. So what are the causes and outcomes of the need assessments? So there are three columns you will see. Reasons are pressure points, here are what is the context and what is the outcome. So first we will go by the reasons. Reasons, that is the pressure points, are the rules and regulations of the organization, that is the legislation. In the case of the legislation, that is most of the time it is the HR manual. In the model 4 I have discussed about the OCB, organizational citizenship behavior. So in that citizenship behavior it becomes very important what are the fundamental guidelines, rules and duties. If employee is able to follow those particular rules and regulations, then first he has to be communicated what behavior is expected here, what duties are expected here. It is just like a newly wedded daughter in law comes into the house, and then she has to be told by the mother in law, that is these are the guidelines, this in this family this works, and therefore this is the expectation that you will behave like this, and these are the expectations are there of the family. So like similarly the new employee when he joins an organization, and that time he has been told by the HR department, however the HR department is not the mother-in-law, the HR department will tell about, that is what are the expectations, the rules, regulations are there, that is these are the rules, regulations, and what is expected from the new employee, that how he will have a conduct in this particular organization. For example, I would like to take for the second point, lack of basic skills, is that is about the any particular professional qualified candidate, whether he is an engineer or BTech or he is the MBA, and in that case if he is not having any particular experience, that is why he is kept on training, management training, engineer training, because it is it is assumed that is he will not having the basic skills in general. Like in case of the MBA, there will be certain students those who are having the work ex of the 5 years also, but in the normally it will be assumed that is the students or the employees those who are entering, they are not having that particular basic skills, they are having the basic skills, and therefore that will be a pressure point. That yes, training has to be identified, that is what type of the training is to be provided to this particular candidate. Even if there are the old employees, those who are working since 3 years, 5 years, and their performance is poor. Now as I mentioned earlier in module, that is there are the different skills, job knowledge skills, behavioral skills, analytical skills, and designing skills, creative skills. 4 types of skills are important. So poor performance may be because of the lacking in the job knowledge, lacking in the teamwork, HR skills, lacking in the basic concepts itself, or lacking into the creativity and providing the solutions to the problems. Then this type of these are the reasons. If the person is not able, these are the part of the ability. If the employee is not able because of these reasons, job knowledge not knowing, job knowledge knowing but HR skills are not there, job knowledge and HR skills are there but basic concepts of the production process is not known. All 3 are there, but whenever any problem comes, the person is not able to find out the solution, and therefore in that case this becomes the poor performance may be there. If the poor performance is there, then that will be also a pressure point to identify the training need. Now we are having importing the technology. if we are importing the technology, new technology is there, or in the organization the first time that any technology is introduced, then definitely that will be also a pressure point, that is the employees are to be trained because they have never worked on this particular machine earlier. So, that is the new technology that is to be developed. Many times the customer suggestions, customer request comes, that is why you do not adopt this particular process, this particular methodology, the functioning style, and if this type of the request comes, that also creates a pressure points because the customer needs that, and if the customer demand is to be fulfilled, then we have to adopt that particular functioning style. If that particular function style is to be adopted, our employees are to be trained. So, that again is important point for identifying the training needs. Then new products are developed. Whenever organization is developing the new product, then definitely that those skills are required, and then those skills are to be trained into the employees, so those who can support to the product user, that is customers. So, that the product user or customers, they will take this particular support only when then your own employees, organization's own employees, those who are trained, that is now we have developed this new product will operate in this way, and when it will go into the market, your sales executives, they should be aware, that is they should train to the customer, that is how to make the use of that particular product. Next pressure point is day by day there is a high competition, and if you want to survive in this competitive environment, it becomes very important, that is you have to go for the higher performance standards. For going for the high performance standards, again you have to adopt the new style of functioning. To adopt the new style of functioning, again training need is there, and therefore in that case one can identify how to what type of training is to be provided. Now we are talking about, that is many jobs are replaced by the technology. So, there are new jobs are there, either we acquire technology. So, when we acquire technology, again to learn the technology, the new jobs are to be created. The old jobs will not be able to satisfy that, right. Like I remember, that is in the old textile mills there were the power looms, right, and then the power looms were replaced by the jet looms. So, now the nature of job itself changed. So, those who are the employees who are not aware of this particular running how to jet looms, they have to be trained, only in that case they will be able to perform. So, these are the rules, regulations, our employees are lacking the basic skills, or the poor performance is there, or new technology, customer request, new products, higher performance standards, and the new jobs are there. So, all these are the reasons or the pressure points which creates you to identify causes for the need assessment. So, there can be the one of them or all of them or some of them will be the pressure points to provide the training, and we can, from these points we can understand where is the need of the training program. Now, what is the context? The context is organizational analysis, person analysis, and task analysis. I will discuss this in the further slide also. So, therefore, in that case you will find that is whenever we talk about the organizational analysis, right, what parameters are there, person individual analysis, and what task he is performing. So, maybe the organization analysis, person analysis is satisfied, but the task analysis requires a training program is there. When we understand the pressure points, when we know the context, what we do, what trainees need to learn, that we understand. Who receives the training, we identify those employees, those who are going to receive this particular training. What training method is appropriate, that we will be able to understand. Frequency of training, that is it should be the monthly or the quarterly or half yearly or once in a year, what frequency of training is to be provided. How training should be evaluated, evaluation of training we will know, and how to facilitate transfer of training, that we will know. These are the points which we will be discussing in the different modules also. So, we have talked about in the previous slide organizational analysis, person analysis and the task analysis are the competency model. First we will go through the organizational analysis. Organizational analysis will be the strategic direction. At the top management level there is a need for the strategic direction, that is what type of the strategic directions are needed. Support of managers. Support of managers is very important. That is, unless and until there is no support of managers, then we will be not having that particular style of functioning, and we will not be able to give the output. Now, the peers, the employees for training activities, that we will see, that is how an organization provides all these particular context are provided is there. Then we will talk about the training resources. Training resources are the resources which are required to be provided at the time of the training. If we are able to provide the resources at the time of the training, then we will be making the organizational analysis. Organization is having, that is, the all sort of the resources or not, the people, process, technology, the venue, the money, man, machine, all resources that will be seen to provide a training is available or not. Second is person analysis. Person analysis is the person characteristics, the input, output, consequences and feedback that has to be seen whether it is provided or not. And task analysis will be the work activity, that is a task, the knowledge, skill, ability, personal capability, competency, whether the person is having that particular competency or not having that particular competency. Conditions under which tasks are performed, and that is the not only the task perform analysis, but also the surrounding environment, whether they are able to provide these conditions under which tasks are to be performed or not. Finally, we see that is on the basis of the organizational analysis, person analysis and task analysis, are we able, do we want to devote time and money to training? That will be the question, and if your answer is yes, then training and development methods, the evaluation, learning environment, transfer of training, that will be implemented. So, whenever we talk about the need assessment process, these are the very important points, that is, if you want to first identify whether the training is to be provided or not to be provided, go through the organizational analysis, person analysis and task analysis, and on basis of this then we can decide whether there is a need for a particular training or not. So, this is all about the training need assessment. Thank you.